Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Ajay, for the kind presentation. At the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Bharat Gothoskar, the entire team at Khaki Lab, for presenting me with this opportunity to speak about the naval heroes today. So today I will be speaking about the naval heroes, women in the Royal Indian Navy during the Second World War. But before I delve into the topic, let us see how women and the maritime medium are perceived together. Across various civilizations, the seas have long placed a place of mystery and wonder, and often governed by rituals and beliefs that shaped the life of the seafarers. In ancient India, seafaring was an essential part of trade and exploration. However, women on board were often considered a bad omen. Now, this belief stemmed from a mix of cultural norms and superstitions. It was thought that the presence of a woman would anger the sea gods and thus bringing storms and misfortunes. These superstitions were deeply ingrained, reflecting broader societal roles and expectations of women during that era. Yet, women were engaged in onshore activities such as fishmongers, engaged in pearl fisheries, etc. Similarly, in many Western maritime traditions, the superstition against women on ships were prevalent. Many sailors shared the belief that women on board would bring bad luck. This notion was propagated by the idea that sea was often like a male-dominated domain where the presence of women could incite jealousy and spite the ocean gods. Such superstitions were reinforced by the masculine culture of seafaring, where, physical strength and endurance was prized and women were seen as distractions or symbols of vulnerability. In India, we revere Lord Varuna as the Lord of the Seas or the Lord of the Oceans. Again, this is a masculine entity here. But I feel it is interesting to see how rivers are seen as feminine entities. In the tapestry of Indian culture and spirituality, rivers hold a unique and a sacred place. They are not mere water bodies, but are often personified as feminine deities that embody this benevolence or ferocity. This duality actually mirrors the complex between nature and femininity itself. Rivers are venerated as life-giving goddesses. Their role as nurturers or sustaining civilizations for the millennia are looked at. But in stark contrast, as I mentioned earlier, the seas and oceans are perceived as masculine, which are governed by Lord Varuna, and he represents the vastness, the depth, the mystery of the seas. While rivers are worshipped for their nurturing ability, they also possess a destructive aspect. Same river that nurtures can also flood and cause devastation. Their floods can wash away entire villages and take lives. This destructive power serves as a sort of a reminder of nature's unpredictability and the respect that it commands. And just as the goddesses in mythology can be fierce warriors, the same is true even for women today. This interplay between the nurturing and the destructive, the feminine and the masculine, reflects the harmonious duality that is essential to the world. Now, coming to the prowess of Indian women in the maritime and naval sectors, let us take a brief look at our history. We have Rani Abbaka, the Queen of Ullal, who fought many battles against the Portuguese, raising strong native resistance against the colonial power. We have Rani Chennabhaira Devi, who was regarded as the pepper queen of India by the Portuguese, as her kingdom was sort of engaged in a lot of maritime activities and trade with the Arabs and the Portuguese. Then we also have the Maratha Navy under the Angres, who found patronage and support from Queen Tarabai, the de facto ruler of the Marathas. Now, despite these superstitions and beliefs that I had discussed earlier, women have made significant contribution to India's maritime history. Even today, we celebrate the courage and resilience of women and those who defied these beliefs and have made their mark on high seas, reminding us that the spirit of exploration and adventure knows no gender. Now, in recent times, we have an all-women crew of 6 officers of the Indian Navy that circumnavigated the globe under the Navika Sagar Parikrama. This was done on board INSV Tarini, which was a first for India. We also have Commander Prerna Devasthali, the first woman officer to command an Indian naval warship. While there are many other women in the Navy who have achieved great feat, I would also like to mention the supreme sacrifice made by Lieutenant Kiran Shekhawat, who happens to be the first woman to be martyred in line of duty. Coming to the shipping sector, we also have Sumati Morarji, who is affectionately called as the first lady of Indian shipping. She was the first woman in the world to head an organization of the ship owners, which is the Indian National Steamship Owners Association. And of course, we have Captain Radhika Menon, the first woman Indian Merchant Navy captain, and Miss Reshma Nilofar, the first woman to be a river pilot in India. These women have broken barriers and proved that the maritime domain is not just a man's job alone. Now, all this is happening today, but do we know when and how did women join the naval service in India? That is the question that I began looking for this topic that I'm speaking today. What were the circumstances that led to the induction of Indian women into the Navy and thereby them getting a chance to wear the naval uniform? Let's take a quick look at history again. The Navy was one of the most important assets that aided the British in their imperialist agenda. From their inception in the Indian waters during the Battle of Swally in 1612, the British naval force in India found its beginnings. Under the English East India Company and later even under the British Crown, the Navy was prepared for the protection of the commercial interest due to the profits that was generated. The naval fleet transitioned through time and have been known by varying titles since its first inception, which is splashed on the screen. In the 20th century, Indians have contributed immensely during the First and the Second World War, and yet their contribution and significance of Indians remain like a footnote in the global historiography of world wars. Right now, you're looking at a number of Indians who were recruited in the First World War. While women were not recruited for active duty, their contribution in terms of employment in industries, in agriculture and other sectors which facilitated the war and the war efforts is, unfortunately, it finds no mention in recorded history. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945, it jeopardized the entire global political configurations, and the entire world became like an active theater of action. Britain declared her entry in the Second World War on 3rd of September 1939. Flashed on the screen is a newspaper article from 4th of September 1939. And immediately after this, the Viceroy of India, then Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, he announced India's participation in the war, which actually met with a mixed response from the Indian political leadership. But eventually, India participated in the war nonetheless. Britain's entry into the war necessitated like the expansion of the Royal Indian Navy for the defense of her coasts, her harbors, and the seaborne trade. Man, money, power, and munitions all were crucial in supporting the Allied cause. Consequently, the Indian coast, it had to be actively defended due to the increase in the potential threat. The Royal Indian Navy undertook combat duties and rendered commendable service in the Middle East and in the Bay of Bengal theatre. Its vessels operated in the European waters as well, and in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic. These are some of the images of Indians in action during the Second World War. Along with the coastal defense, transportation of troops, the RIN personnel, they also carried out non-operational duties such as laying submarine and telegraph cables. This happened between Bombay to Suez. They also had to upkeep the lighthouses, undertake hydrographic surveys. All these were a part of their job. Now, during the course of the war, the Royal Indian Navy had expanded haphazardly due to the need of the hour. Regulations were changed to recruit largely among the Indian population. Many of them recruited from the hinterland and hinterland, even from Punjab, which shows the highest number of recruitment rate, which is of 25.5%. The entry of Japan into the Second World War in 1941, it increased the burden and responsibilities of the Royal Indian Navy. With the Japanese occupation of Singapore in 1942 and its close proximity to the Indian waters, it was deemed necessary to have more men on active service to protect the frontiers of India. And this was because India was an important and a prized colony for the British. And thus, this is the mass mobilization of the troops that was happening. The RIN was expanded haphazardly due to the need of the hour, and regulations were changed to recruit largely among Indian population. And as I was saying, Punjab showed the highest recruitment rate of 25.5%. And with the entry of Japan into the Second World War in 1941, the burden and responsibilities of the Royal Indian Navy increased. So with the Japanese occupation of Singapore in 1942, and with the close proximity of Japan in the Indian waters, it was deemed necessary to have more men on active service to protect the frontiers, as India was an important and a prized colony for the British. And thus it was also an important asset for the Allied forces' war efforts. Now, the period of the Second World War witnessed global upheaval. It extended beyond the battlefield to societal structures and challenged traditional gender roles and provided women with, a lot of new opportunities. The outbreak of the war prompted the British to reassess its military strategies and mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale. So, recognizing the importance or the need for additional personnel, including women, this was to support the war effort. The Women's Auxiliary Corps India was formed on 9th of April 1942. It was constituted to provide auxiliary support to the military, which allowed the male soldiers to be released for combat duties. It was initially formed to provide personnel for the service in the army, but later on it expanded to sort of render assistance to the Navy and the Air Force as well. The members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps were recruited from diverse backgrounds. The creation of the Women's Auxiliary Corps not only addressed the immediate manpower shortage, but it also laid the groundwork for challenging societal perceptions of women's capabilities. Now, next, during the course of the war, when the threat of Japanese invasion of India began looming at large, the newly formed Women's Auxiliary Corps, it rallied to the war efforts. In order to assist the operations of the Royal Indian Navy, the naval wing of the Auxiliary Corps was formed on 12th of February 1944. One of the first Indian servicewomen to join the Corps was Chief Petty Officer Moina Imam, whose picture on the extreme right of the screen This was carried in the newspaper Bombay Chronicle Weekly. Here we can see them dressed in a uniform along with the other members. HMIS Talwar, which was again a signal school at Bombay, was one of the first centers where courses for signals auxiliaries were arranged. As the war progressed, it was Royal Indian Naval Headquarters which was transferred from Bombay to Delhi, and so did the naval headquarters of the naval wing of the Women's Auxiliary Corps. On 2nd March 1945, the wing was renamed as the Women's Royal Indian Naval Service. Now, this was a brainchild of Admiral John Henry Godfrey, who was the flag officer commanding Royal Indian Navy. And the WRINS was a response to the desperate need of volunteers to fill up the shore jobs, which the Navy needed, so that more and more men could join the war efforts at sea, which was the active theatre of operations. An English woman by the name Commander Margaret Cooper was promoted as the chief officer and deputy director of the Women's Royal Indian Naval Service. She began an intensive campaign across British India to recruit women for service in the Navy. In the beginning, the wives and daughters of serving British officials, Anglo-Indian women, all joined the services. And gradually, it expanded and included a lot of Indian women who were educated and those who had like an aptitude for the job. Assessing this need for manpower, the British also started publicity campaigns regarding the recruitments and the opportunities across defense services, which included the the Women's Royal Indian Naval Service as well. The minimum age limit, which was fixed for the entry, was 18 years, but it was later amended to lower the minimum age to 17 years for entering the WRINS. The women personnel were promised things like grant of pay, training. Women were also promised accommodation and mess allowances. This was for the upkeep of their uniform. They were also promised medical attention. And all this was to sort of make it a lucrative career option for Indian women who seldom had such opportunities at large scale. Now, during the period of war, as the volume of encoded messages increased, we also see that there were contingency plans for the Navy, which provided for additional personnel. This was to share the load at cipher offices and signal communications establishment. The recruits who had joined, they were trained and engaged as cipher operators and coders. Some were teleprinter operators, switchboard operators, stenographers, clerks, and the likes. So this was the kind of training that the recruits were given to undertake these roles and responsibilities. So some of the important recruitment centers and training units of the Women's Royal Indian Naval Service were HMIS Talwar and HMIS Firoz, which was at Bombay, HMIS Jahanara, which was based at Ahmednagar, HMIS Nalini, which was based at Calcutta. Some personnel of the WRINS were also engaged at the Naval Gunnery establishment at Bombay. Although they were trained at arms, but they were not given onshore. They were only given onshore jobs. They were not given at sea training. We can also see how the recruitment of women into the Navy, it marked a significant departure from sort of traditional gender norms. Since it allowed a lot of women to serve in roles that were previously reserved for men. The recruitment process sought individuals with specific skills. Now, this included excellent skills in communication, in administration, even technical expertise. Women were further trained to undertake wide range of responsibilities such as signal communication and intelligence and administrative duties. Their proficiency in Morse code and it also proved invaluable in maintaining effective communication with the naval forces.
once the women personnel completed this sort of basic training, they were employed for secretarial appointments. So even for sea transport officers and mail officers and other administrative appointments. Yeah, they also worked in war information room in detachment and other unit offices. And they were also engaged in keeping an account of pay, of allowances and furlough. This additionally, when a personnel, they were also involved in intelligence gathering. They were also contributing crucial information for uh, strategic decision making during war times. So these are the sort of role of women personnel who were at work by then. Next, yeah. So by 1945, the RINS was it received a greater response and it continued their work on shore. In order to study the British establishment and the structure and sort of the function of the Royal Navy, three officers from the Women's Royal Indian Naval Service. One was Chief Officer Margaret Hooper. Second was a second officer called Phyllis Cunningham, and second officer Kalyani Sen. All three were sent to London. And Second Officer Kalyani Sen became the first Indian servicewoman to visit the United Kingdom, and thus she was also the face of modern Indian women abroad. The creation of the Women's Auxiliary Corps and the Women's Royal Indian Naval Service both had profound implication for women's empowerment in India. Now, by participating in roles which were traditionally reserved for men, women gained new exposure and they were now empowered with new skills and experiences, and they were also challenging preconceived societal notions. And this was regarding their own responsibilities and capabilities. The war effort not only showcased women's ability to contribute meaningfully to the nation's defense, but it also set a precedent for their involvement in other sectors post independence. Now, as you can see, this is like an official government report of World War One, where they've said that Indian women from diverse classes are far less able than their European sisters to replace men required for military service. Now, this was disproved by the RINS during with their service during the Second World War when it was at its peak. In 1943, the RINS had enlisted 41 officers and 204 ratings on their record. And by 1945, it had increased to 242 officers and 746 ratings amongst the women alone. So reports suggest that by 1945, approximately two-thirds of women were recruited in the Royal Indian Naval Women's Royal Indian Navy were Indian nationals, and the rest were British and other Commonwealth expats. Yeah. An important feature of the Women's Royal Indian Navy were their uniform. Now, this was the first time that Indian women would wear naval uniforms. The Women's Royal Indian Navy had customized uniforms which sort of resembled the one which were worn by the Women's Royal Naval Service, which was the British counterpart. Now, although there were few exceptions like the change in the brass buttons, the same which had been brought out by this thing has been brought out by Miss Valentina Vitali, who has done some excellent work on this subject, and her work has actually provided a strong foundation for my research and analysis. So I would like to thank her for setting the research ground for me and for people who are interested in this thing. So here we see two styles of uniforms which were developed for the Women's Royal Indian Navy. One which consisted of a smart tricon, which topped off with a trim blue jacket and a skirt and a white shirt and a black tie for the officers. And on their shoulders, their initials, that is WAC, Women's Auxiliary Corps, India, it appeared in light blue. The ratings also wore initials on their shoulders and they sported caps. As the enrollment of Indian women increased, a second uniform, which was an Indianized, which was it paved way for a white sari with a blue border. It had a distinction lace with a jacket for the officers and distinction badges in case of the ratings. So this inclusive step of having an Indianized uniform, it also garnered good response from Indian women who would wear this uniform and served with pride. The advertisements. Now, advertisements for recruitment of the women in the Royal Indian Navy, they were placed in newspapers. They also have an interesting story to say. It appealed to the Indian senses by catchy phrases like India needs women for victory, join women's auxiliary corps. I hope you can see it, or probably I'll just read one of the advertisements. This is the one from Bombay Chronicle. It says, "Your present and your future, Women's Royal Indian Naval Service offers the women of India a magnificent chance to prepare themselves to take an important part in shaping their country's future." Now, also, I would like to say that while I was researching for this topic, here it is something interesting to note, and what can be analyzed that through these advertisements is that the induction in the military forces, it continued till almost till June 1945. It is important to note this, that the Second World War, it ended in August 1945, merely 2 months later. So here, for instance, the war against Japan goes on, help to bring final victory nearer. This can be read on an advertisement which is published in the Amrita Bazar Patrika on 16 May 1945, while the other one, which is posted in Times of India in June 1945, it says, "Prepare now and join the WRINS." While there was an increased nationalist sentiment in India due to India's own freedom struggle, this was also because even that was running parallel at the time. This clever publicity also saw a positive increase in the number of recruitments in the Women's Royal Indian Naval Service. Next. Yeah. The end of hostilities in August 1945 witnessed a large-scale demobilization of troops, which were inducted in large number during the time of crisis. The role of the Royal Indian Navy in India's defense was appreciated by Admiral Godfrey, and it was covered by the press. But certain measures for de-induction of troops had to be undertaken. As mentioned earlier, the recruitment continued right till the month of June 1945. So it was a sudden blow for the personnel of the Royal Indian Navy that the scheme of demobilization was reported in the newspaper merely a month after the end of hostilities in September 1945, wherein they announced that 10,000 troops were to be released from the service. Recruitment to the women's cadre was suspended, and two recruitment centers, which was HMIS Jahanara and Nalini, both were closed down. Women's Royal Indian Naval Service also it ceased operations eventually, despite the recommendation of Admiral Godfrey, who was against the disbandment of WRINS. The service eventually discontinued. Next. Now, for any naval unit, the crest or a symbol is of great importance, since it becomes that identity of the unit. Women in the Royal Indian Naval Service also had exclusive. They were serving exclusively on as an onshore establishment. So the crest design here, it depicts a river tern, which is set against the blue and white waves. A river tern is actually a bird, which is a feature of an India river scene, mostly found near the Gangetic Plains or near the river Ganga. The bird is associated with water, but it does not go to sea, or it does not go to high sea. So here the use of river turn as the crest of the WRINS is also very symbolic. Next. It is also crucial to analyze the importance of WRINS. So as a unit, which can be, it can be ascertained the importance because it had a crest of its own. Although they knew that, this was a temporary thing, the service was going to be a short-lived one, yet the entire crest and everything was sanctioned for them. The contribution and service of the WRINS during the war were acknowledged by they were also acknowledged by the British, and the women were also included in the contingent in the Victory Parade, which was held in Delhi in 1946. I have a short clip. So actually, this was a very short clip wherein the women were marching on this Victory Day parade. So it is also available on YouTube on the British Pathe channel. So people who are interested can also take a look at it later. Um, yeah, so can we go to the next slide then? So women in the Royal Indian Navy, the personnel that they faced a lot of challenges during their services. While the men reported their service grievances like unhygienic condition and substandard food, there was racial discrimination. uh, this eventually led to the cause of the Royal Indian Naval Uprising of 1946. But the grievances of the service women also existed, but they were not reported at the same time. So a lot of research has to be done in this even on this topic. So for women who served in the Women's Royal Indian Navy, it was a life-changing episode for them. However brief their association was, it also had certainly empowered them. And women veteran, they were also sought after for jobs. After they were disbanded from the services, they were also the preferred candidates. So while I was looking at some of the advertisements in the classified section wherein job vacancies are posted, I found some interesting ones which called for a lady stenographer, preferably ex women auxiliary corps or RINS candidate was a preferred choice. So gender bias and stereotypes were all prevalent, but these women had to overcome these societal expectations and prejudice to sort of prove their capabilities in this male-dominated field. The Second World War, it served as a catalyst for change in gender dynamics worldwide, as women also took non-traditional roles to support war efforts, right? So in India, the RINS became the symbol of New India, which subverted gender norms. It emancipated women from the shackles of traditional patriarchal norms at the time and also empowered them to take challenges head on. Now, though women were not allowed to go to sea, they became instrumental in naval life and played an important role in defeating the enemy. Recognizing and sort of honoring the service of the women Royal Indian Naval Service veterans, this is not only a testament to their individual sacrifices, but it is also a small step towards acknowledging the broader importance of gender diversity in the armed forces. So, as India continues to strengthen its naval capabilities, the legacy of the RINS remains like a source of inspiration for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Very interesting talk. So, comment by Suman Nene here. Salute to the proud women who worked in the Royal Navy in early times and led the women to follow. True, and it's a very inspiring talk that you've given us. So, a question here that I had really is, given the social and cultural norms at the time, what were the motivations or factors that led these women to join the war effort?
So as we have already seen, the independence movement is also going on, the India's freedom struggle. So people or women did want to play an active role in, in the military or in towards contribution towards the freedom struggle. Yet, during the Second World War, there was a need where women were also needed to go and sort of take up active duties. So that promoted, it was the need of the hour when women came to the rescue, and hence it was important, and sort of that is the reason they took up the job. Yeah.
Okay. Supratik had a question. Any women Navy personnel later joined Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's INA?
There is no record of it available, but it's an interesting question. I'll also look it up. But there's nothing mentioned per se.
Okay. Ruth says, interesting talk. Thank you. Another question. I mean, can you provide any details on demographics or the backgrounds of the RINS recruits? I mean, also there's a fairly high proportion, I would assume, of Indian nationals compared to British or Anglo-Indian women.
So initially, these were the wives or the daughters of naval officers, right? Who immediately joined the services because their fathers, their brothers, or their spouses had gone on active duties. So as solidarity, they would come together and they also joined the service, at least to contribute in some way or the other, right? So that is how the initial recruitment happened. Later on, it was open for women in India in general, and in that, some of the educated ones did take up the jobs. For example, we have Kalyani Sen. So she was married to an army major, but she also joined the naval wing to serve. Absolutely.
Anyway, there's a comment here from, I don't know the name, it says Shiomi, the phone. Thank you, ma'am. I'm a PhD scholar. My topic is women officers in the Indian Air Force. You have guided me. Hope for more talks.
Thank you so much.
Very interesting. So the other question that sort of came to mind is, how would the experiences of the RINS in India, the members, differ from their counterparts in the UK? Any differences in terms of experiences, perspectives, any insights that can be gained really by comparing the two organizations?
Certainly. See, the women in UK, they had also participated during the First World War. So they did have a lot of experience than the Indian women per se, because we joined during the Second World War itself, right? So they did have that during the period between the First and the Second World War, the interwar years. They also were having a lot of other training. They were also grooming, and their efforts was also they were also being trained for that matter. So Indians did not have that as a footage. So that is the only comparison that I could draw. And there was again, there was, one can say there was a sort of pay disparity and those things, because it did exist. Sometimes it still exists even today, but back then it was even more stark. So yes.
Yeah.
These are the two things that comes
right. Sure. And given that these were women serving in what was then fairly non-traditional roles, right? Is there anything on sort of what challenges and barriers they faced while they were doing what they were doing, either during service or after service?
So
do we know anything about that?
Immediately during service, it was yes, they were pitted against the men when it comes to their pay, their rank, and everything. It also comes as a difference between women women officers and women ratings, like women who are the junior sailors. So differences between them as well. and the difference also between the UK counterparts and the Indians who were, because we also had, like, Chief Officer Margaret Cooper, who was the deputy director of RINS. She was also bestowed with the like post-war. She was also bestowed with the Order of the British Empire uh, by the British government. So, and we don't see any other women, Indian women, getting bestowed with such honor. So, such kind of differences are uh, prevalent. So, yeah.
Okay. And really, one final question from me, which is the last point that you made when you were talking about of RINS being disbanded,
Right.
and then women were, of course, given priority, I guess, for other roles. But did any of these women end up joining the Indian Navy, or was it really just outside the purview of what the Indian Navy was willing to look at that point?
Okay, now that is interesting because after it got disbanded in 1946-47, there was no entry point for women. There was no point that women could join the Indian Navy, because that entry was absolutely removed. And I think it was only in the late 1990s where women were again, like, could resume or could join as short service commission officers in the Indian Navy. So in the period between 1947 to late 1990s, there was no women in the Navy.
Okay, 1992 is what Xiaomi says.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Okay, well, I guess there's no further questions. Thank you for a very enlightening talk this evening.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to everyone else too for joining us, and please join us next week for another interesting chat. All right, thank you guys. Thanks everyone. Thank you, Janhavi, and have a nice weekend, everyone.
Thank you so much.